Have you ever given every piece of yourself to a person, only for them to tell you that you're not enough? That you will always be second place? I have. And this is the story of how I stopped being their doormat and became the one who owned the entire building. It all came to a head at a Christmas family dinner. The air in my in-laws' house was so thick you could taste it, a cloying mix of pine needles from the aggressively large tree in the corner, the scent of roasting turkey, and the bitter aroma of years of passive aggression. I sat at their polished mahogany table, a ghost in my own life, smiling until my cheeks ached. For 5 years I had been Jessica Evans, wife of Mark, daughter-in-law to Robert and Carol. But to them, I was always just Jess, the charity case. Mark had inexplicably married. They never said it outright, of course. They were too classy for that. Instead, it was in the way my mother-in-law, Carol, would explain simple recipes to me as if I'd never seen a kitchen, or the way my father-in-law, Robert, would pat my hand and call my business degree cute. My biggest sin in their eyes was my background. I didn't come from money. The small inheritance my grandmother had left me was the only real asset to my name, and I had foolishly, lovingly poured most of it into their failing family business, Sterling and Sons Construction. I saw potential, a path to modernization. They saw my money as a temporary patch for their sinking ship, and now that the well was dry, my value had evaporated. They believed every penny was gone. Tonight, the subtext became text. The humiliation was no longer a subtle chill in the air. It was a roaring fire. It started with the gifts. My sister-in-law, Tiffany, the family's golden child, unwrapped a velvet box from her parents. Inside was a glittering diamond bracelet. She held it up to the light, her wrist angled just so. "Oh, Daddy, it's exquisite," she cooed. Then, her eyes, sharp and cold as ice chips, found mine across the table. "It's just so wonderful to be part of a family that understands the value of beautiful, lasting things. Some people," she said, her voice dripping with false pity, "just don't appreciate gifts that are meant to be cherished forever." The jab was so obvious it sucked the air out of the room. I felt a hot flush creep up my neck. I was wearing the simple silver locket my grandmother had given me, my most cherished possession. Mark, my husband, just smiled and squeezed Tiffany's shoulder, completely oblivious. Or worse, completely complicit. Later, as Robert carved the turkey, he talked about the struggles at Sterling and Sons. I saw an opening, a foolish, desperate attempt to prove my worth. I was reading a report on new zoning variances downtown. I began, my voice sounding small in the suddenly quiet room. "There's a huge opportunity in converting old commercial spaces into mixed-use residential units. If we shifted our focus." Robert stopped carving. He looked at me, a slow, condescending smile spreading across his face. Then he let out a short, barking laugh. "Oh, Jess, you and your little ideas. A dreamer." He turned to Mark. "Your wife is quite the dreamer, son." The table chuckled along with him. I shrank in my chair, my brilliant idea reduced to a child's fantasy. I was a failure, a woman with useless hobbies and an even more useless mind. The final fatal blow came during dessert. Mark cleared his throat, unable to meet my eyes. "So, just an update on our vacation plans. With things being so tight at the company, we're going to have to skip the trip to Hawaii this year." Tiffany set her fork down with a loud clatter. "Again? Honestly, Mark, when are you going to get your finances in order?" She shot me a venomous glare. "I know why. It's because Jess drains all his money with her useless hobbies and her projects." I waited for Mark to defend me. I waited for him to say my name with love, to tell his sister she was out of line. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I looked at him, my heart pounding a desperate rhythm against my ribs. "Please, Mark, say something." He turned to me, and his eyes were not the eyes of the man I had married. They were cold, hard, and belonged entirely to his family. "She's right, Jess," he said, his voice flat. "You need to understand your place. My family comes first." His words hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't breathe. I looked around the table. Robert was nodding, a smug look on his face. Carol was examining her manicure, completely unbothered. Tiffany was smirking, victorious. They were a united front, a wall of judgment, and I had just been firmly and finally excluded. I was a nobody. In that moment, sitting at their Christmas dinner table, I had never felt so utterly and completely alone. That night, the house was silent, except for the sound of Mark's steady breathing from the master bedroom. It was a sound I used to find comforting, the rhythm of our shared life. Now, it was the sound of betrayal, a steady, metronomic beat, counting down the seconds of my life I had wasted. Each exhale was a fresh gust of air on the embers of my humiliation, stoking them into a quiet, burning rage. I didn't cry. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside me, a solid block of ice in my chest. Instead, I moved with a strange, dreamlike clarity. I pulled a single duffel bag from the top of the closet, the one we used for weekend trips. The irony was bitter on my tongue. As I packed, my mind was a slideshow of sacrifices. I saw myself, at 25, turning down a promotion at a top consulting firm because Mark had insisted he needed me here, with him to support his family's business. "It's our future, Jess," he'd said. I saw the faces of old friends fading from my life. Their invitations declined one by one because of a last-minute family obligation at the Sterlings. Most painfully, I saw the bank statement showing the wire transfer of my grandmother's inheritance. $80,000 given with love and hope, swallowed by the black hole of Sterling and Sons, with nothing but a condescending pat on the head to show for it. They hadn't just insulted me, they had systematically erased me. They had taken my past, my money, my present, my time, and my future, my career, and told me it was all worthless. The taunts from dinner echoed in my head, a vicious chorus. Dreamer, useless, failure, loser. I zipped the bag, leaving behind 5 years of my life. I left the photos on the mantelpiece, the books on my nightstand, the life I had tried so hard to build. I walked through the dark living room, past the phantom shapes of furniture that felt like they belonged to a stranger. I didn't even take the car he had bought me. I took my old reliable sedan, the one I'd owned before I even met him. It felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself. I drove with no destination, the city lights blurring into long streaks of red and gold through my windshield. I was a ship cut loose from its moorings, adrift on a cold, dark sea. After an hour of aimless driving, the exhaustion hit me like a wave. I pulled into the parking lot of a grim-looking motel off the highway, its sign flickering a sad, neon welcome. The clerk looked me over with tired, indifferent eyes. "Just one night?" "Yes," I said, my voice hoarse. I pulled out my credit card. He ran it, a moment of panic. It was declined. "Insufficient funds," he mumbled, not even looking at me. My blood ran cold. Mark must have already cut me off. He hadn't even waited 24 hours. The struggle was no longer an abstract fear. It was here, tangible and suffocating. I fumbled in my wallet for my debit card, linked to the small secret account my grandmother had insisted I keep. It was my last resort. "Try this one," I whispered, praying it would go through. It did. The relief was so overwhelming I felt dizzy. In the cold, sterile room, with its stained carpet and the smell of stale smoke, the full weight of my situation crashed down on me. I had less than $2,000 to my name. I was a 30-year-old woman with a brilliant mind and a master's degree, and I was a hair's breadth away from being homeless. I sat on the edge of the lumpy bed and finally let out a single, ragged sob. Then I stopped. Crying wouldn't help. I needed a plan. I needed an ally. I scrolled through my phone, past the names of people who only knew me as Mark's wife, until I found her. Eleanor Vance. My old boss. A woman who had once told me I had the sharpest strategic mind she'd seen in a decade. My hand trembled as I pressed the call button. It was after midnight. She probably wouldn't even answer. But she did, on the second ring. Her voice was as I remembered, sharp, clear, and with no room for nonsense. "Vance, Eleanor, it's Jessica Evans." My voice broke. There was a pause. I expected annoyance, confusion. Instead, I heard a soft sigh. "Jessica, I was wondering when you'd finally leave them." Her words stunned me. She knew. She had always seen it. "You have a place to stay," she said, her tone shifting from knowing to commanding. "My guest house is empty. I'm sending you the address. But you're not coming here to cry. You're coming here to build." It wasn't an offer of pity. It was a call to arms, a lifeline. In that cold, lonely motel room, for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just an exit. It was the beginning of my secret transformation. The next morning, I drove to Eleanor Vance's home. It was less a house, and more a modern fortress of glass and steel, perched on a hill overlooking the city. It was the physical manifestation of the woman herself, formidable, elegant, and with a clear view of everything. The guest house was a miniature version of the main building, a detached studio that was larger and more luxurious than the apartment Mark and I had first shared. It was clean, minimalist, and blessedly quiet. It was a world away from the suffocating chintz of my in-laws' home and the desperate grimminess of the motel. This place wasn't a refuge. It was a command center, a war room. Eleanor greeted me not with a hug, but with a mug of strong black coffee. She was in her late 60s, with a shock of silver hair cut in a sharp bob, and eyes that missed nothing. She was semi-retired, but her mind was as active as ever. She was my ally, and she wasted no time on sentiment. "Grief is a fuel, Jessica," she said, sitting across from me at a small glass table. "You can either let it burn you down, or you can use it to power an engine. The choice is yours. Today you grieve. Tomorrow we work." And we did. The first week was a blur of raw emotion. The anger, the hurt, the deep, gut-wrenching betrayal. I let it all out. Eleanor listened, nodding, never judging, but never letting me wallow. She was like a master blacksmith, letting the metal heat until it was white-hot and malleable before she began to shape it. On the 8th day, she walked into the guest house and dropped a file on the table. "The pity party is over," she announced. "Time to build." She opened the file. Inside were my own bank statements, which she'd had me print out. She pointed a manicured finger at the small, forgotten account, the last of my grandmother's inheritance. "I spoke with your grandmother before she passed," Eleanor said softly, a rare note of tenderness in her voice. "She told me she made you promise to keep this separate. She said it was your Phoenix Fund, for when you needed to rise from the ashes." Eleanor's sharp gaze met mine. "This isn't for survival, Jessica. It's for victory." Her words sparked something in me. For the first time, I didn't see that small sum as a lifeline. I saw it as a weapon. We spent the next several weeks in a feverish state of creation. My grief, just as Eleanor predicted, transformed into a powerful, laser-like focus. We worked 18-hour days, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of purpose. My background in business strategy, so long dormant and mocked, came roaring back to life. I felt synapses firing that had been dark for years. The business plan we developed was audacious. I would create my own real estate investment firm. I would call it Apex Holdings. My greatest weapon was the very knowledge I'd gained from the Sterling. For years I had sat in on their business meetings, absorbing every detail about local contractors, zoning laws, material costs, and undervalued neighborhoods, all while they saw me as little more than a piece of furniture. That knowledge, which they had dismissed, was now my secret arsenal. But the tangible struggle was real and humbling. I put on my best suit, one of the few things I had packed, and went to the banks. The loan officers were polite, but patronized. They saw a 30-year-old woman with a thin credit file, a recent separation, and a business plan that seemed too ambitious. The rejections stung, each one a small echo of Robert's dismissive laugh. A dreamer, their polite letters seemed to say. There were nights I'd collapse onto the bed in the guest house, the weight of my near failure pressing down on me. I was terrified. What if they were right? What if I really was a loser? But every time I hit a wall, Eleanor was there. She wasn't a cheerleader, she was a coach. She ripped apart my proposals with red ink, forcing me to make them sharper, more airtight. She drilled me for hours, role-playing as a skeptical investor, until I could counter every objection with unshakable confidence. Finally, after a particularly brutal rejection, she sighed and picked up the phone. "All right, you've proven you can fight," she said. "Now you just need someone to open the gate." She made a call to a friend of hers, the head of a private equity firm. She didn't ask for a favor, she presented an opportunity. Then came her most tangible act of support, the one that changed everything. "I'll co-sign the initial seed loan," she told the man on the phone, "and I'm personally investing a portion of the startup capital. Her success will be my success." She hung up the phone and looked at me. "He'll see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. Don't be late." Eleanor Vance didn't just give me advice. She put her money and her formidable reputation on the line for me. She was the rock I built my new foundation. She had opened the door. Now it was up to me to storm the castle. As the first fragile roots of Apex Holdings began to take hold, the calls from my old life started. The first was from Mark. His number flashed on my screen. A jolt of anxiety and anger. I let it go to voicemail. The message he left was exactly what I expected. A torrent of wounded pride and righteous indignation. "Jess, where the hell are you? You can't just walk out like that. My parents are worried sick. You owe them an apology. You embarrassed me. You embarrassed the entire family. Whatever little tantrum this is, it needs to stop. Call me back. Now." There was no "Are you okay?" No "I miss you." Just anger that I had disrupted his world, that I had dared to have a reaction to his cruelty. He called again the next day, and the day after that. The tone slowly shifted from anger to a cloying, manipulative concern that was somehow even more insulting. "Jess, honey, I'm worried about you. Are you safe? Just come home. We can talk this out. I know I said some things I shouldn't have, but you know how my family gets during the holiday. It was just stress. We can fix this. We can fix this." The words echoed in my head. What he meant was I could fix this by coming back, by apologizing for my own humiliation, by smoothing things over and pretending it never happened. I deleted every message without a response. My silence was a wall he couldn't breach, and it was the first taste of power I'd had in years. Then, about 2 weeks after I'd left, a different number called. It was David, Tiffany's husband, the ultimate enabler. I remembered him at the Christmas dinner, sitting silently beside his wife as she launched her verbal grenades. He hadn't laughed, but he hadn't defended me either. He had just stared at his plate, his shoulders hunched, a portrait of spineless neutrality. I decided to answer. "Hello? Jeff, it's David." He sounded deeply uncomfortable, his voice low and rushed as if he were hiding in a closet. "Hey, look, Tiffany is going crazy, and Mark is a mess. And," I asked, my voice cool, "and, look, I just think maybe you should come back, or at least call Mark. You know how they are. It's just easier for everyone if you smooth things over." Easier for everyone. He meant easier for him. Easier than having to listen to his wife's rants. Easier than dealing with the tension at family dinner. He wasn't calling out of concern for me. He was calling out of a desperate desire for his own peace and quiet. His plea for me to surrender for the sake of peace was the final confirmation I needed. His silence at that dinner wasn't just weakness, it was a form of consent. He had watched them tear me down, and had chosen his own comfort over basic human decency. A cold, hard resolve solidified in my chest. "David," I said, my voice calm and devoid of the emotion he expected. "Do you remember at Christmas dinner when your wife called me a gold digger and my father-in-law called me a fool?" He stammered. "Well, I mean, you know Tiffany. She just says things. And you said nothing," I finished for him. "You sat there and let it happen. So let me be very clear. The time for smoothing things over is gone, David. You all made your choices. Now I'm making mine." I could hear his sharp intake of breath before I hung up the phone. I blocked his number, then Mark's, then the landline for Robert and Carol. The silence that followed was profound. It wasn't an absence of sound. It was the presence of peace. It was the sound of me choosing myself. The interaction with David hadn't broken me. It had fueled me. It reinforced my conviction down to the bone. They would never ever change. The only way to win wasn't to change their minds, but to change the entire game. And I was just getting started. 6 months passed in a whirlwind of relentless work. The woman who had fled in the middle of the night was gone, replaced by someone I was only just beginning to recognize. The fear and desperation had been forged into a sharp, unyielding purpose. Eleanor's guest house was no longer my home. It was just a place I slept for a few hours a night. My real home was the small, leased office space I'd secured for Apex Holdings downtown. It smelled of fresh paint, new beginnings, and the potent aroma of brewing coffee that was my lifeblood. Apex Holdings was no longer just an idea on paper. It was a real, functioning company with a growing portfolio. My strategy was simple but effective. I used the insider knowledge the Sterlings had so carelessly given me to identify undervalued properties that the bigger players overlooked. A dilapidated warehouse in a neighborhood just on the cusp of revitalization. A small block of storefronts with bad tenants that were actually just poorly managed. I saw the potential where others saw problems. The very skills they had mocked as useless hobbies were now making me money. My first big win was a rundown triplex I bought at a foreclosure auction. The Sterlings themselves had passed on it months earlier, with Robert declaring it a lost cause. I poured my seed money into a smart, targeted renovation, new kitchens, updated bathrooms, a coat of modern gray paint. I didn't overspend. I was strategic. 3 months later, I sold it for more than double what I had paid. The profit wasn't just a number on a bank statement. It was a validation that echoed louder than all their insults combined. With that capital, I bought another property, then another. I hired a small, fiercely loyal team. A young, hungry real estate agent named Sarah, and a semi-retired accountant named George, who loved the thrill of a startup. They didn't know my backstory. They only knew me as Ms. Evans, their sharp, decisive, and sometimes scarily focused boss. I was no longer the woman who was kicked out of her own life. I was a founder. Eleanor watched my progress with the quiet pride of a master who sees her apprentice coming into her own. She would stop by the office once a week, not to interfere but to observe. She'd ask probing questions that forced me to defend my decisions, keeping me sharp. "Never get complacent, Jessica," she'd say. "Success can make you as blind as failure." I was starting to feel like myself again, or rather a new version of myself. The old Jessica was soft, eager to please, and constantly seeking approval. This new Jessica was forged in betrayal and fueled by ambition. She was tougher, sharper, and didn't need anyone's approval but her own. One rainy afternoon, I was at a coffee shop near my office waiting for a meeting. At the table next to me, 2 men in suits were talking loudly about the local construction scene. "Total mess over at Sterling and Sons," one of them said, shaking his head. "I heard they're leveraged to the hilt. One more missed payment and they're going to go under." "Robert Sterling always was too proud for his own good," the other replied. "They're desperately seeking a buyout, but who would be foolish enough to take on that much debt?" I froze, my coffee cup halfway to my lips. My heart began to pound, not with fear but with a cold, electrifying clarity. All this time I had been focused on building my own kingdom, on proving them wrong by succeeding on my own terms. But listening to those men, a new, more audacious idea began to form in my mind. An idea that was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. It wasn't enough to just move on. It wasn't enough to just be successful. I was going to rewrite the ending to their story. The secret transformation was no longer just about me. It was about to become about them. A cold, clear plan settled into my mind. I wouldn't just build my empire next to theirs. I would build it on their ruins. The plan was a declaration of war, fought not on a battlefield, but on balance sheets and in boardrooms. It was time to stop being the victim of their story and start being the architect of their downfall. My first call was to Eleanor. I laid out my idea, my voice steady, betraying none of the wild, thrilling fear that was coursing through my veins. I wanted to buy their debt. I wanted to become the ghost in their machine. Eleanor was silent for a long moment. I could practically hear the gears turning in her brilliant mind. "It's aggressive," she finally said, a slow smile in her voice. "It's ruthless, it's perfect, but you can't do it as Jessica Evans. You need a ghost." That's when my secret war truly began. With the help of Eleanor's extensive legal and financial contacts, we constructed a labyrinth of shell corporations and holding companies. Apex Holdings would be the heart, but the arms that reached out to Sterling and Sons would have innocuous names like Midwest Capital Ventures or Ridgefield Financial Group. I became a phantom creditor, an invisible force pulling strings they couldn't see, let alone comprehend. The first step was to identify and acquire their debt. It was surprisingly easy. Sterling and Sons had been borrowing recklessly for years, taking out high-interest loans from second- and third-tier lenders just to make payroll. These lenders were nervous, eager to offload the risky debt for a fraction of its face value. My shell companies started buying it up, piece by piece, until Apex Holdings, through its various proxies, was the primary entity to which Sterling and Sons owed its existence. They never saw it coming. Their arrogance was my greatest ally. They were so blinded by the Sterling name, so convinced of their own legacy, that they didn't bother with the due diligence. They didn't check who was behind the new letterhead on their overdue notices. They only saw that Ridgefield Financial was offering a slightly more lenient payment extension than their previous creditor. They saw it as a stroke of luck, a sign that their fortunes were turning. I had a special phone line and email set up for my role as the anonymous creditor. My lawyer, a stone-faced man named Arthur who worked for Eleanor, would handle the direct communications. But he would send me the recordings of every phone call. Listening to them was a surreal experience. I'd sit in my sleek modern office, looking out over the city, and listen to the voice of my father-in-law Robert on speakerphone. "Arthur, my friend," Robert would boom, his voice full of false charm. "You tell the folks at Ridgefield that Robert Sterling always pays his debt. We've just had a temporary cash flow problem. We appreciate their patience. We're on the verge of landing a massive contract that will solve everything." He was lying, of course. I knew their books better than he did. There was no massive contract. He was just kicking the can down the road, boasting and blustering to a man who was reporting every word back to me. After he hung up, I would be the one to instruct Arthur on the terms of the next payment plan. I'd grant them an extension, just long enough to give them a sliver of hope, before tightening the noose a little bit more. I would approve a small disbursement to cover their payroll, making them dependent on my unseen generosity. It was a dangerous, high-stakes game of chess. A single misstep, a leaked document, a curious journalist, and my cover would be blown before I was ready. I was living a double life. By day, I was Jessica Evans, the rising star of the local real estate scene, the savvy founder and CEO of Apex Holdings. But by night, I was the unseen force methodically dismantling the House of Sterling, the family that had tried to destroy me. The power shift was seismic, but completely silent. They were living in a house that was on fire, completely oblivious to the fact that I was the one holding the map, and I was just waiting for the perfect moment to watch it all burn down. Just as my secret war was reaching its critical phase, an unexpected invitation arrived. It was embossed on thick, cream-colored cardstock, the kind of ostentatious thing Carol and Tiffany adored. It was an invitation to Tiffany's engagement party. My first visceral reaction was to tear it in half and throw it in the trash. The thought of being in the same room with them, of enduring their pitying looks and veiled insults, made my stomach clench. I called Eleanor, intending to tell her I was refusing. She cut me off before I could even finish my sentence. "You're going," she stated, not as a suggestion but as an order. "Eleanor, why would I possibly subject myself to that?" I asked, exasperated. "I have work to do and have their company to dismantle." "Exactly," she replied, her voice sharp. "This isn't a social call, Jessica. It's reconnaissance. You need to see your enemy, see their state of mind. But more importantly," she paused for effect, "you need them to see you, not the broken woman who fled in the middle of the night. They need to see the woman you are now. Let them underestimate you to your face. It will make your victory that much sweeter." She was right, of course. So on a warm Saturday evening, I drove my new car, a sleek, black Audi that I had paid for in cash, to the opulent country club where the party was being held. I chose my outfit carefully, not a dress, but a tailored dark blue pantsuit that was the epitome of understated power. It was armor. My arrival caused a ripple in the perfectly curated atmosphere. I saw Carol whisper something to Tiffany behind her hand, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disdain. They clearly thought I had crashed the party. Mark saw me, and his face went through a rapid series of emotions. Surprise, a flash of something that might have been longing, and finally, a mask of cool indifference. He started to walk towards me, but I gave him a look so cold it stopped him in his tracks. I turned my back on him and headed for the bar, brushing him off with a silent, dismissive grace. "We have nothing to discuss," my posture screamed. That's where I met Liam. He was standing near the bar, observing the crowd with an intelligent, amused detachment. He was handsome, in a sharp, well-defined way, with a look of genuine confidence that was a world apart from Mark's hollow charm. He was introduced to me by a mutual acquaintance as Tiffany's fiancé, a highly successful and respected real estate developer. The irony was not lost on me. "Liam, this is Jessica Evans," the acquaintance said, before quickly scurrying away as if I were contagious. Liam extended a hand. His grip was firm. "A pleasure to meet you, Jessica. I've heard your family." I replied, my voice even. Meeting his gaze directly, he didn't flinch or look away. He was new to this toxic ecosystem, and assessing it with fresh eyes. He watched as Tiffany glided over, looped her arm through his, and gave me a smile that was all teeth. "Jess, I'm so surprised you came," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I wasn't sure you'd be able to afford the valet." Liam's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges. He had seen the undisguised venom. "I manage," I said simply, taking a sip of my club soda. Later in the evening, Liam found me again as I was looking out over the golf course. "That was intense," he said, gesturing vaguely back towards Tiffany. I just shrugged. "So what is it you do, Jessica?" he asked, his curiosity seeming genuine. "Tiffany mentioned you had some hobbies." I met his gaze, a small, knowing smile playing on my lips. "I'm in investments," I said, nothing more. A flicker of interest crossed his face. He was a man who understood the language of money and power. The word investments meant something to him. He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He looked from my calm, confident demeanor to the family across the room, who treated me like a stray dog who had wandered into their party. He was seeing the disconnect between the useless woman they had described and the composed, self-assured person standing before him. He was a developer. He understood foundations and facades. And in that moment, I could see him realizing that the Sterling family's facade was hiding something rotten underneath. The seed of doubt had been planted. He didn't know what the truth was, but he knew, with certainty, that he was being lied to. The time was right. The months of strategic planning, of sleepless nights and relentless pressure, were about to pay off. My ghost companies had successfully cornered Sterling and Son. Their other credit lines were maxed out, their assets were mortgaged to the hilt, and their reputation was in tatters. They were officially functionally bankrupt. Their only hope was a full buyout from the one entity that had shown any interest, the mysterious investment group known as Apex Holdings. My lawyers, led by the unflappable Arthur, had prepared the final offer. It was a lowball, an almost insulting figure that would barely cover their outstanding debts and leave them with next to nothing. But it was the only offer on the table. It was this, or a humiliating public bankruptcy auction, where their family name would be dragged through the mud for all to see. They had no choice but to accept. The preliminary agreement was sent. All that was left was the final signature. The night before the papers were to be officially signed, a profound and unexpected wave of hesitation washed over me. I was alone in my office, the city lights twinkling below like a blanket of fallen stars. My victory was so close I could taste it. But instead of triumph, I felt a hollow ache. On my desk was a small, framed photo I kept tucked away in a drawer. It was from my wedding day. In it, Mark and I were laughing, his arm wrapped around me, his eyes crinkling at the corners. We looked happy. We were happy once. Before his family's poison had seeped into our marriage, before he had chosen their approval over my heart. Was this vengeful path truly worth it? I had already won. Apex Holdings was a success beyond my wildest dreams. I was financially independent, respected, and powerful in my own right. I could just let Sterling and Sons die a natural death. I could walk away, leaving them to their fate, and focus on my own bright future. For a fleeting moment, I considered calling Arthur and telling him to withdraw the offer. Let them collapse on their own. Then, as if summoned by my moment of doubt, the memory of that Christmas dinner flooded back with startling clarity. I wasn't just remembering it. I was reliving it. I could feel the heat of my own humiliation, the sting of being laughed at. I could see Robert's smug, dismissive face as he called me a dreamer. I could hear Tiffany's cruel taunts about my useless hobby. And then, I heard Mark's voice, clear as if he were standing right next to me, delivering the line that had severed my soul from his. My family comes first. The hesitation vanished, burned away by the memory of that profound betrayal. This was never just about money or business. This wasn't even about revenge, not entirely. It was about justice. It was about taking the narrative they had forced upon me that I was a failure, a loser, a nobody, and proving, in the most undeniable way possible, that they were wrong. It was about showing the man who had abandoned me exactly what he had thrown away. I straightened my shoulders, the hollow ache replaced by a cold, steely resolve. I picked up my phone and dialed Arthur. My voice was calm and firm, with no trace of the doubt that had plagued me moments before. Arthur, it's Jessica. Miss Evans. Is there a problem with the agreement? No, I said. Proceed with the acquisition tomorrow as planned. There's one more thing. I need you to book a table at the Grand Oak Resort for next Saturday night. A large one, for 8 people. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Of course, ma'am. Under what name shall I make the reservation? A slow, cold smile spread across my face. Don't worry, I said. They'll be inviting me. The call came 2 days later, just as I knew it would. Mark's name flashed on my screen. A number I hadn't blocked, an asset I had kept in reserve for this very moment. I let it ring twice before answering, affecting a tone of mild surprise. Hello? Jess? It's Mark. His voice was buoyant, dripping with a condescending, triumphant tone that made my skin crawl. He was trying to sound magnanimous, like a king granting a pardon to a foolish peasant. Listen, Jess, I know we've had our problems, a lot of problems, but I'm calling with some incredible news. I stayed silent, letting him fill the space. Our company has been saved, he gushed. It's a miracle. This big-shot investor, some firm called Apex Holdings, is buying us out. They're going to inject new capital, restructure everything. Dad is thrilled. We're back, Jess. We're really back. I could picture him perfectly, pacing his father's office, running a hand through his hair, a proud, foolish grin on his face. The arrogance was breathtaking. To celebrate, he continued, my family is hosting a celebration reunion dinner next Saturday, a new beginning for Sterling and Son. We want you to be there. You want me to be there? I asked, my voice a careful blend of disbelief and vulnerability. Yes, he said, his tone softening into one of faux generosity. I want you to come. I want you to see what you gave up. I want you to see what a real family, a strong family, can accomplish when they stick together. Maybe it will give you some perspective. They were inviting me to my own victory party, intending for it to be my final, public humiliation. They wanted me to witness their salvation from the cheap seats, to rub my nose in the success they believed they had achieved in spite of my departure. It was more perfect than anything I could have planned. Okay, Mark, I said, my voice quiet. I'll be there. The dinner was set for the Grand Oak Resort, the most exclusive and expensive restaurant in the city, a place reserved for power players and old money. The reservation, of course, had already been secured by my lawyer. They had unknowingly walked right into the stage I had set for them. I also made one other call, to Eleanor. It's time, I told her. Saturday night. The Grand Oak. I'll be there, she said, a note of fierce pride in her voice. Wouldn't miss it for the world. On Saturday night, I arrived alone. I had spent more time choosing my outfit than I had for my own wedding. It was a charcoal gray power suit, exquisitely tailored, paired with a simple silk blouse. It was severe, elegant, and screamed money without a single logo. My hair was pulled back in a sleek, severe chignon. I was no longer the soft, approachable Jess. I was Miss Evans. The hostess led me to the grand private dining room they had booked. The entire family was already there, bathed in the warm, golden light of the chandelier. Robert and Carol, looking smug and relieved. Tiffany, preening in a new dress, her arm linked with Liam's. David, her husband, looking as uncomfortable as ever. And Mark standing by his father's side. The prodigal son who had weathered the storm. Liam stood slightly apart from the group, his expression sharp and analytical. He was watching everything. My arrival silenced their cheerful chatter. Carol gave me a thin, tight-lipped smile. Jessica, how nice of you to join us. They had seated me at the far end of the long rectangular table, a deliberate and obvious act of exclusion. I was an afterthought, a footnote to their grand celebration. Mark gestured to the chair. Here you go, Jess. We saved you a spot. I took my seat without a word. A few tables away, in the main dining area, I saw Eleanor take a seat by herself. She caught my eye and gave me a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. The pieces were all in place. The audience was seated. The curtain was about to rise on the final act. The dinner began with a performance. Robert, at the head of the table, stood up to make a toast, his chest puffed out like a proud rooster. He raised his crystal glass of champagne, a triumphant gleam in his eye. To family, he began, his voice booming in the private dining room. In times of trial, it is family that sustains us. It is family that endures. Sterling and Sons is more than a company. It is a legacy, and that legacy is secure, thanks to our own resilience and a little faith from a wise investor. He then had the audacity to look directly at me, his eyes filled with a kind of pitying condescension. It's a lesson some people learn the hard way, he said, his voice dropping slightly. When you abandon family, when you choose your own selfish path, you end up with nothing. We, on the other hand, are stronger than ever. A murmur of agreement went around the table. Mark nodded gravely, as if his father had just imparted some profound wisdom. I felt the heat of their collective judgment wash over me, but on the outside, I remained a perfect statue of calm. I met Robert's gaze and held it, my expression unreadable. Then it was Tiffany's turn. She raised her glass, her diamond bracelets sparkling under the chandelier. "And a toast to our new owner," she chirped, her voice high and shrill. "Whoever this Apex Holdings CEO is, they're a genius for seeing our value. Unlike some people." She shot a pointed, venomous look my way. The implication was clear. The new owner was smart, and I was the fool who had walked away from a winning team. The family laughed, a smug, self-satisfied sound that echoed off the paneled walls. It was the same laugh from that Christmas dinner, but this time it was louder, more confident. They believed they had won. They were reveling in what they perceived as my ultimate defeat. Mark, emboldened by the pack mentality, leaned across the small space separating us. His voice was a low, conspiratorial whisper, meant only for me, but laced with a cruelty that was designed to cut deep. "See, Jess?" he whispered, a smirk playing on his lips. "This is what you could have been a part of. Real success. But you were always a failure at this. You never understood what it took." He sat back, satisfied, as if he had just delivered the final killing blow. "You're a loser, Jess. It's sad, but it's the truth." They were doing exactly what I had known they would do, publicly humiliating me one last time, cementing their narrative that I was the one who had lost everything. They needed me here to witness their victory, because their success felt hollow without my failure as a counterpoint. I said nothing. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, my hand perfectly steady. I let their words hang in the air, each insult a nail they were hammering into their own coffin. My silence seemed to unnerve them more than any argument could have. Across the table I saw Liam, watching the entire exchange with a deepening frown. His fork was paused mid-air, forgotten on its way to his mouth. He looked from Tiffany's gloating face to Robert's smug satisfaction, then to Mark's cruel whisper, and finally to my serene, almost placid calm. He was an intelligent man, a man who read rooms and people for a living, and the scene wasn't adding up. The viciousness of their attack was wildly out of proportion. My lack of reaction was even more baffling. His brow furrowed as he looked at me, his sharp eyes filled not with pity but with a dawning, intense curiosity. It was the look of a man realizing that he was the only one in the room who didn't understand the real story, and he was desperate to figure it out. Robert stood once more, his face flushed with wine and victory, ready to deliver the grand finale. "And one final toast," he declared, his voice resonating with self-importance. "To the future of Sterling and Sons, and to the mysterious, brilliant CEO of our savior company, Apex Holdings. Wherever you are, we thank you." He raised his glass high. Mark, Tiffany, and Carol all followed suit, their faces beaming with pride. It was the perfect, dramatic moment, the peak of their arrogance. And that's when it happened. The door to the private dining room opened softly. A man in a crisp, black tuxedo, the general manager of the Grand Oak, stepped inside. He moved with an air of quiet authority, his eyes scanning the room. Robert, assuming the manager was coming to congratulate him on his good fortune, gave a magnanimous nod in his direction. But the manager's path was not towards the head of the table. He walked silently and deliberately past Robert. He walked past Mark, who was still holding his glass aloft. He walked the entire length of the mahogany table, his polished shoes making no sound on the thick carpet, making a direct, unwavering beeline for me, sitting in my place of exclusion at the very end. He stopped beside my chair. The entire table froze, their champagne glasses hovering in midair. The celebratory chatter died instantly. The only sound was the faint clinking of silverware from the main dining hall. The manager bowed his head slightly, a gesture of profound respect. "Miss Evans," he said, his voice perfectly clear and audible to everyone in the now silent room. "We are ready for the final transfer authorization whenever you are, ma'am." He placed a sleek, black tablet on the table in front of me, angling it so only I could see, but in the reflection of the polished table, The words on the screen were just visible enough. A title in bold, official font, acquisition document, Sterling and Sons by Apex Holdings, and below it, a single glowing line next to a digital signature box, final approval, Jessica Evans, founder and CEO. The silence in the room was no longer just quiet. It was a physical presence. It was a vacuum that sucked all the air, all the pride, all the arrogance out of the atmosphere. It was absolute. Mark's jaw dropped. It didn't just fall open, it hung slack. A look of such utter slack-jawed disbelief on his face that he looked like a cartoon. All the color drained from his face, leaving him a pasty, sickly white. Robert turned pale. It was a violent, shocking transformation. The ruddy, confident flush of moments before vanished, replaced by a ghastly gray pallor. His hand, the one holding his champagne glass, began to shake uncontrollably, the liquid sloshing over the rim and onto the white tablecloth. Carol let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her throat as if to physically keep a scream from escaping. Tiffany just stared, her eyes wide and unblinking, her perfect, smug smile frozen on her face like a grotesque mask. They were all utterly, completely shocked. They were speechless. Their brains were visibly trying and failing to process what was happening. The woman they had just spent the entire evening mocking as a poor, useless failure, the nobody they had cast out, was the very person who held their entire world in the palm of her hand. I looked up from the tablet, my gaze sweeping over. She said, her voice carrying the weight of her own formidable reputation. Congratulations. Her public endorsement was a cannonball through the hull of their sinking ship. Eleanor Vance was a legend in the city's business community. Her approval was a stamp of legitimacy that no one could question. Robert looked at her, then back at me, his mind clearly fracturing under the strain of this new reality. The second, and perhaps most damning, ripple came from within their own party. Liam, who had been watching the entire drama unfold with a stunned intensity, slowly began to clap. It wasn't loud, sarcastic applause. It was a slow, deliberate, and deeply respectful clap. 1, 2, 3 times. He looked at his fiancée, Tiffany, whose face was a mask of horror. And then he looked directly at me. His eyes, which had previously held only polite curiosity, were now filled with a newfound, profound respect and a touch of awe. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. It was loud enough for the entire table and several nearby tables to hear clearly. "Congratulations, Miss Evans. Truly." His validation was the final dagger. Liam was one of them, or was supposed to be. He was a respected peer in their world. For him to so clearly and publicly take my side was a social execution. He had judged the situation and declared me the victor. I saw Tiffany flinch as if he had physically struck her. The whispers started then, spreading like wildfire through the restaurant. The other diners, the city's elite, were all staring now. They had witnessed the public humiliation, and now they were witnessing the even more public reversal of fortune. In a single moment, the Sterling family went from being the hosts of a victory party to the subjects of a humiliating spectacle. Finally, a voice from the family broke the spell. It was David, his face ashen. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a terror that was almost comical. "Jess, you bought the company?" he stammered, the words tumbling out of his mouth. He looked at his wife, then at his father-in-law, as if hoping one of them would tell him this was all a terrible joke. But he found no comfort there, only shattered pride and dawning panic. The collective weight of these reactions created a force field around me, pushing my antagonists away. They were completely and utterly isolated. Their power, which had always been derived from their shared name and social standing, had been incinerated before a live audience of their peers. Mark finally looked at me, his eyes pleading, filled with a desperate, pathetic confusion. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The man who had so confidently told me my place, just minutes before, was now a broken, silent statue of his own failure. The ripple effect was complete. They weren't just defeated, they were erased. Mark finally found his voice. It wasn't the confident, booming tone of the man who had called me on the phone, nor the cruel whisper he had used at the table. It was a pathetic, broken thing, a fragile thread of sound in the heavy silence. "Jess, what is this?" he asked, his eyes wide with a desperate, childlike confusion. "What have you done?" I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt nothing, no anger, no pain, not even the sweet satisfaction of revenge. There was only a calm, quiet finality. The emotional hold he and his family had on me was completely gone, severed by the clean, sharp blade of my victory. I reached into my sleek leather purse, the one I had bought with my own money, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I didn't slam it on the table. I didn't make a show of it. I simply slid it across the polished wood surface. It stopped directly in front of him. He stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. His hands trembled as he reached for it, his eyes never leaving my face. He fumbled with the clasp and pulled out the contents. The bold, stark heading was unmistakable, even from across the table. "Petition for dissolution of marriage. Divorce paper." "You said your family comes first, Mark," I said, my voice steady and clear, each word a carefully placed stone building the wall that would now stand between us forever. "Consider this my gift to you. It frees you up to focus on them completely." I then let my gaze drift over the rest of them, a general surveying her conquered territory. "I own the resort, by the way," I added, almost as an afterthought. "So don't worry about the bill. Dinner's on me." This last piece of information seemed to break something in Rob. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat. I wasn't just their creditor, I was their host. I had orchestrated their final supper in a palace that I owned. I turned my attention back to business. My voice became crisp, devoid of all emotion, the voice of a CEO delivering unwelcome news. "As for Sterling and Sons," I announced to the table at large, "the company is being dissolved, effective immediately. Its viable assets will be absorbed by a new subsidiary of Apex Holdings. Your positions, Robert, Mark, are terminated." I looked at Tiffany and Carol, and just in case there was any confusion, "Your corporate credit cards along with all other company accounts have been frozen." I stood up, my chair making a soft scraping sound on the floor. I smoothed down the front of my jacket, a final composed gesture. I looked at the shattered remains of the family that had tried to shatter me. Carol was now openly sobbing, her face buried in her hands. Robert was staring into space, his face a slack mask of utter devastation. Tiffany was looking at Liam, her expression pleading, but he refused to meet her eye. And Mark was just staring at the divorce papers, his world, his identity, his entire sense of self, dismantled and laid bare on a restaurant table. Without another word, I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The last thing I heard as the door to the private dining room swung shut behind me was the sound of Carol's weeping. The fallout was absolute. Their worldview wasn't just shattered, it had been systematically bulldozed, and I was the one driving the machine. In a single evening, they had lost their company, their legacy, their reputation, and their scapegoat. They had been publicly and professionally checkmated by the one person in the world they believed was a nobody. The story concludes a few months later. I'm not in a restaurant or a war room anymore. I'm in my real office, the CEO's office, on the top floor of a downtown skyscraper. The entire western wall is a floor-to-ceiling window, and the skyline of the city sprawls out before me, glittering under the afternoon sun. This is my view. This is the world I built. Apex Holdings is more than thriving. It's becoming a force in the regional market. I did exactly what I said I would. I dissolved the toxic structure of Sterling and Sons, sold off its most valuable land assets for a significant profit, and absorbed their few skilled, non-family employees into a new, much more efficient construction subsidiary. My empire was built, in part from their ashes, but it was growing on its own merit. I occasionally hear things about the family, whispers on the wind of the business world. Liam, true to the character I had glimpsed, broke off the engagement with Tiffany, A week after the dinner, he couldn't stomach being tied to a family built on such venom and delusion. I heard Robert and Carol were forced to sell their large, ostentatious house to cover personal debts, and Mark, stripped of his family name and reputation, was struggling to find a job. He was just another man with a spotty resume and no powerful father to open doors for him. But these are just echoes from a life that is no longer mine. They are characters in a story that has already ended. My revenge was a necessary step, a catalyst that forced my own transformation. But I am not defined by it. I am defined by the strength I found in its pursuit, by the company I built, and by the future that is now entirely my own. As I look out at the city, my city, I feel a sense of peace that is deeper and more profound than any victory. I am free. My story is proof that the labels other people give you, failure, loser, nobody, only have power if you let them. The moment you decide to write your own definition of who you are is the moment you take back your power. So I have a question for you. What labels have you refused to accept in your own life? What's a moment you stood up and proved someone wrong? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about turning the tables. Your support means the world. Thanks for watching.